Good afternoon. I think we're live. Give me just 1 second. I want to finish this tweet and then we are good. Pulling double duty this afternoon, moderating a panel, getting social set up, and getting all that done. And I think we have one more panelist who should be joining us in just a second. And while she gets set up, let's go ahead and start with some introductions. So today's panel is going to be about creating diverse, equitable, and inclusive language, specifically kind of talking about affordable housing and homelessness. If you were here for the keynote with Mark, he talked a little bit about poverty porn, which I think is a conversation that kind of is a nice way to lead into this, because he mentioned, those commercials that we've all seen of, for 25 cents a day, you too can help, this little African child with a stick of gum or whatever. And I think it's really important for us as a sector to think about how we can create inclusive messaging and how we can think about what's next. I think we learned a lot with the 2020 elections. I think we've been learning a lot with the misinformation around COVID and all these crazy conspiracy theories. And I'm, very thankful to know that I will not be the only zombie if it comes down to that. So I look forward to seeing the rest of you as zombies as well. But let's go ahead and start with some quick introductions. I'm Amanda Nelson. I am the Director of Communications here at the San Diego Housing Federation. And I will pass it over to Lisa Halverstadt.
Hello, I'm Lisa Halverstadt. I'm a reporter for Voice of San Diego, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a nonprofit news website. And I focus a lot of my time on covering issues of homelessness and affordable housing.
Great. Tyler.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Renner. I'm Director of Media for PATH, which stands for People Assisting the Homeless. We are a statewide homeless and housing service provider, and I'm happy to be with you all.
Great. And Madison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison Coleman. I am a policy advocate with Climate Action Campaign, which is a San Diego and Orange County based nonprofit with a simple mission to stop the climate crisis through effective policy action. On a day-to-day basis, I'm advocating for affordable housing, inclusive zoning, and smart growth throughout the San Diego region. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. And Hafsa, and I see you've got my name on there, so sorry about that. I sent you a link, but we're gonna just work through it. Mercury in retrograde ended yesterday, so we're still dealing with the effects, but please go ahead and introduce yourself.
That's completely fine. My name is Hafsa, and I am the new Director of Homelessness Strategies and Solutions appointed by Mayor Gloria.
Wonderful. And she's just fresh on the job, and I'm so excited she's able to join us today, because I love that this is a panel of a journalist, city, a service provider, and then, Climate Action Campaign, which is tangentially, I think, related to housing. As we all know, climate policy is housing policy. And I think there's a huge overlap. So for those here watching today, we're going to jump into a few questions, but feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and we will also go through those towards the end. And feel free to kind of just ask questions as they come up so you don't forget them, and I'll be sure to review the chat and get all that in there. So we'll kind of just do this round robin-y. I don't know how you guys show up on your end, but I guess we'll just start with like Madison and go to Lisa, Hafsa, and Tyler. So the first question I have is, how does your organization talk about homelessness and housing? And think about this in terms of not just maybe your social media, but also maybe internally. So yeah, let's dive in.
Cool. So thank you for that question. So CAC has five fights or five main areas of focus, which are 100% clean energy, bikeable, walkable neighborhoods, world-class transit, shade trees, and all electric homes. And our five fights are fought through a lens of equity and justice, because we know that the climate crisis hits communities of concern and communities, disadvantaged communities first and worst. So we always include that in our messaging. When we're talking about housing and framing our housing advocacy, we frame it around that bikeable, walkable neighborhoods area of focus, and this concept of stopping sprawl and building cities, which is essentially smart growth, in which affordable deed restricted housing isn't just developed, but it's developed specifically near job centers, transit priority areas, and other current and future infrastructures. So when cities are developing in this way, it creates inclusive communities where people can bike and walk to places where they live, work, and play, aka bikeable, walkable neighborhoods. And then another point of advocacy, which you touched on, Amanda, that we talk about housing through is the fact that housing relates to the climate crisis. And the truth is that we can't solve the climate crisis without solving the housing crisis. They're super interconnected and actually need to be solved concurrently. And so when cities create these bikeable, walkable neighborhoods, people become less car dependent, which lowers vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, within the transportation sector, which is the largest source of greenhouse emissions in the San Diego region. So we advocate through all of this through a plethora of different housing, land use, and mobility strategies and solutions within different policies and programs and initiatives, et cetera, that jurisdictions throughout the region are implementing. And then we also advocate through it through social media mediums, op-eds and news articles, recommendations letters to city governances, calls to action, which are usually mass emails to our network of organizations and colleagues to attend, or more than likely give public comment pertaining to a certain topic at different city council and board meetings. And so, yeah, internally, we've come up with this concept of stopping sprawl and building cities. And we talk about how to advocate for housing as a human right. I think that's a super important part to add as well. So I'm sure I'm missing a few things, but that's the gist of our advocacy and how we talk about housing in our space.
I love that. I think you touched on, something that I've personally have gotten into is this walkable city. I live in Mission Hills, and with the start of the pandemic, I gave up my car because it's like I'm not using it. And prior to that, for 6 months, my neighbor had been using my car because she needed to get to work, which is a further way for me than to get to North Park. And I think it's like radicalized me a little bit, I love the walkable part of my neighborhood, and I love that I can get to work taking the bus. And I've been really thinking about that public transit isn't just for low income people, it's not just this idea where it's your everyday essential workers, but it's your high earners as well. And I really love the work that you guys are doing and connecting those dots and really kind of calling out the sprawl. And how that is not where we need to go. So Lisa, please tell us how the Voice of San Diego talks about housing and homelessness. And you just did that really great piece on Homelessness 101 that I was just reading, and I learned a lot from it.
Oh, well, glad to hear that. So Voice of San Diego is a news organization. So that really frames how we talk about homelessness. So, for us, we choose to focus on reporting on our biggest challenges that we face as a community. And certainly housing affordability, or the dearth of affordable housing, whether that's with a capital A or a lowercase a, is a major issue. Also, clearly, we have a homelessness problem. There are lots of people that are unfortunately living on our streets or in their vehicles. And so when we think, though, about our coverage at Voice, we really kind of put our work into two different buckets. One is explaining complicated government things and, avoiding all the wonky terms that make things sort of inaccessible maybe to the larger community, to just try to explain so people can sort of onboard to whatever the debate is on housing or homelessness and be able to engage in that. The other piece is to report on the things that maybe not everybody wants you to know. Maybe, following up on how a certain program is going, or, digging into maybe there's some shady stuff going on. Sometimes I dig into that sort of stuff too. But again, really what I strive for in my coverage is to make it approachable, and really to avoid using wonky terms that make it hard for people to follow along. I really have also emphasized wherever I can in my work to try to demystify some of those terms. So I have done, today we published our 101 on how homelessness can be criminalized, where we just tried to explain what are some of those common offenses. And actually, I'll be participating in a panel myself later this week on that topic as part of our PolitiFest. But also I've done explainer posts and videos about the different types of housing for homeless individuals. As you'd imagine, it can be confusing for people. What is affordable housing versus a permanent supportive housing or shelter? So that about sums it up for me. And I'm sure we'll talk more about some of that coverage as we go along here.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what Voice does is so important to talk about it in an unbiased way and being able to provide the facts, and then also really talk about some of the inconsistencies and some of the problems that our sector maybe creates or ignores. And so I think it's really important for the work that you guys are doing. And I think there's so much misconception around like the capital A affordable housing. I'm constantly seeing comments like on Nextdoor about, luxury homes and market rate isn't affordable, but there is people who want market rate. I would like to upgrade to a higher level apartment, but they're a little out of price range. But, if we had more, I could upgrade to where it wouldn't be, kind of anyway. But I think there's a lot of work that's being done, and I'm excited for this conversation because I think it's going to help us, take back some of this to our individual works and think about how we can help going forward. So Hafsa, why don't you tell us about how the city is talking about homelessness and housing?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me on this panel, by the way. And it's so wonderful to hear everyone's different approaches. So with first and foremost, we talk about value, right? Value is very, very important. And one thing that this administration has done, that Mayor Gloria has done, is really change the status quo on how we have addressed homelessness, which quite frankly brought me to San Diego. We are prioritizing the people-centered approach, the approach of a human-centered, making sure that we are hearing the lives of lived experience persons, making sure that compassion and the ability to receive services is at the forefront. And that is a huge shift and really starts with value. From another point of view, I'll speak on internal. Mayor Gloria has invested in this new department that I get the honor to lead, and the department is a new Homeless Strategies and Solutions department. So what we're doing is we're talking about it by also creating an internal capacity to make sure that we're there for the technical assistance as needed, working with our partners such as the San Diego Housing Commission, as well as a regional task force, as well as all the provider bases. So it's really making sure that there is an internal infrastructure that is empowered by this new administration to handle this situation. Coming and having work from all across Southern California, this is really bold and really unique and really people-centered, because oftentimes you'll see leveraged positions in different municipalities to address such a huge issue. So this administration has certainly done a great job in doing that. And then secondly, I would say the external piece is really that collaborative approach, working in tandem with the county. As you know, the county now has its new homelessness department. And then of course, with all of the many different stakeholders and partners, the San Diego the San Diego Partnership, Downtown Partnership, the Regional Task Force, but also really weaving in equity in every single area of it, not just one area, but all throughout. So really listening to lived experience persons, and also understanding that, we do, looking at the data, that's also the expansion of the department. We now have a programs division, and we now have a budgeting and monitor division where we could look at how programs are informing our outcomes, and really looking at, well, what is it saying about Black and Brown communities? What is it saying about LGBTQ communities? How are we making sure that there's equitable access of resources all across the board? So that's really at the forefront. I would say the value, the internal expansion, and then working externally from an equitable perspective. And this administration is working very hard to do that.
Thank you. I love that. I love this value-centered approach, right? I think we need our values now more than ever. And I love that there's this collaboration that seems to be happening among San Diegans that wasn't necessarily happening before, between the city, between the county, and between, even like Voice of San Diego with what you guys are doing with PolitiFest and the speakers that you guys have brought together to kind of, tell a better story of what's happening with our region, and the work that Climate Action Campaign is doing and the work that PATH is doing. And it's so great to see us all kind of coming together after what seems like years of not. And it's really encouraging to see, our elected officials really trying to make a difference and really trying to put equitable voices and values at the forefront, and then also really giving power to the folks who need it, and not just relying on the old boys club of San Diego, but really thinking, forward thinking and thinking about what's next for the next 50 years. So it's really exciting to hear. And Tyler, we'll round out with you. How does PATH talk about housing and homelessness?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So PATH's mission is to end homelessness for individuals, families, and communities. We're in over 150 cities across the state of California. And I think one important message is that homelessness is a systemic problem. It's a collective problem that we have to dismantle the root causes, that being income inequality, lack of social safety nets, lack of affordable housing, systemic racism. So we move away from talking about it as an individual problem, right? Someone's own episode of homelessness is caused by X, Y, or Z, but we're talking about the big picture. This is not something that happened overnight. The solutions are there, but they need to be really, really scaled up. So we're really intentional about the language we use when talking about people who are experiencing homelessness. We use people first language. We say someone who's unhoused or has an episode of homelessness. So we really try to make sure that we're humanizing it, and we're also talking about the big picture. We are doing a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We have for several years because we've recognized as an organization we cannot tackle homelessness or the housing crisis without talking about systemic racism and the root causes of homelessness beyond an individual person's problems that may have led them to experience that. So, we use a lot of jargon sometimes in this. So we try to make sure that we're always explaining that or using it in an appropriate way. We talk about housing first, right, as a model, but we say it's housing first, but not housing only. We have supportive services. What does supportive services look like? What is case management? What is outreach? So we are really trying to explain the work that we do to show that there are solutions. There is hope out there, but we need to just really scale it up if we're going to address what we constantly refer to as a crisis. The homelessness crisis, the housing crisis, and how those work in tandem to keep perpetuating this issue.
I like that, Tyler. And I think, there's so much jargon in housing, and even working at the Housing Federation, there are times when I raise my hand in a meeting, I'm like, what is this acronym? What does that mean? I was listening to a session this morning about decarbonization, and I know what those words mean, but I never thought about what it meant in regards to housing. So then I went, I was listening, but then I went down a Wikipedia hole of trying to figure out, what does this mean? What are gas-powered stoves? Turns out my stove is gas-powered. I don't use it. So, but I think, we need to think about making it accessible for the everyday folks, because how are we going to address homelessness and affordable housing if, your everyday voters aren't really understanding what they're voting for? I got involved with affordable housing through the old Mission Hills Library when that was kind of started, when former Mayor Faulkner said it was a potential site for permanent supportive housing. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And, per Mission Hills, they did what they do best and blocked that. But it was disappointing. And what I learned most was that nobody knew what permanent supportive housing was. They all thought it was going to be like a Father Joe's type of shelter where, people would come and go, and it wasn't a home where people would have on-site care and on-site support and these wraparound services. And so it's kind of been a thing that's inspired me through our conference here to have these kinds of questions and these panels, because I think it really helps. It's something I can share with my friends and say, here, listen, this is what I do. This is where I'm working so hard about housing. And I'm always calling you out and saying, hey, no, don't think about it this way. Affordable housing is 30% of your income, like let's learn together. So Tyler, your comments really brought me into the next question was, some of these myths and conceptions about what's creating homelessness. So Tyler, I'm going to kind of have you start with this one since you're with PATH, but I'd love to hear, a little bit of how do you handle some of these common misconceptions? People choose to be homeless. People are bused here from other states. People, there's no help and they just need to be sequestered in the desert like Borrego Springs. So.
Right. Yeah, it's a common struggle. I think, as I was alluding to earlier, it's moving beyond it as an individual's problem. People constantly want to talk about substance use or mental health issues or, what job someone had. Are they trying hard enough? Are they resistant to services? And we move beyond that to really focus on the work that we do and say that it's not about it's about finding the right service for someone. It's about connecting them to the right opportunity. It's not that folks don't want this. It's you need to meet them where they're at. And that's a big thing at PATH is meeting people where they're at, doing whatever it takes. So we try to understand what causes a person's episode of homelessness. And, in my role, I handle all of our media relations, and some reporters want to do very surface level, well, aren't all these people addicted to drugs? Aren't all these people having mental health issues? Like, do they even want shelter? Like, don't the neighbors dislike that there's a shelter? And that's a very shallow level of reporting that we see pretty often. So I really try to make sure that we get beyond that. And we talk about the solutions. We talk about our program managers. We talk about our staff that are actually doing the work. So we can kind of move away from just focusing on it's one person's problem, right? It's our collective problem that is decades of failure of all these, systems. So yeah, just really moving beyond that. It's one person's fault, right? That they're experiencing homelessness. So the more that we can talk about, bigger picture things, I think the more hope that we can give and show that there are solutions that work. It's just about making sure they're the right solutions at the right scale.
Yeah, that's great. I think sometimes it feels almost like sports where you have to have a winner or a loser. You have to have somebody to blame. It has to, and it's so systemic that at this point, we're like that Spider-Man meme where it's just everybody's pointing at each other because it's so many things, and we have to move past that blame and start focusing on the solutions. Hafsa, I'd like to hear from you with the city about how you guys are handling some of these misconceptions, especially I had the opportunity to meet you at the Mission Hills Library, which it was a great conversation, but it was derailed by one homeless individual in Mission Hills. And you kept speaking up and saying, these really great points. And, and I would love to hear what the city is doing to kind of combat and overcome some of those myths and misconceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go back and reiterate the value, right? The value system is very important, understanding that we are here for to be able to help uplift the lives of persons experiencing homelessness. So, one of the most important things is we understand housing first. And I think housing first is very underrated in several different communities. Sometimes people think that housing first is just like a one and done, but really it's the real fact that if a person experiencing homelessness gets housing and with the level of supportive services needed, then that person is really no longer homeless, right? And I've been doing this, I feel very blessed to be in a position where I've seen different communities all across Southern California. And I've seen people who have been unfortunately don't even see that the NIMBYism is so bad that even when a person is housed and was formerly homeless, that they're still perceived as homeless. And that's so sad. because this is now your neighbor. They've conquered all this with the help of such collaboration and this whole ecosystem of supportive services that so many people work hard in our communities, agencies, cities, counties, task force, like our regional task force and the San Diego Housing Commission, and our provider bases like PATH and over here, Father Joe's and Alphas, and the list go on. So I think one of the most important thing is, number one, recognizing those myths and perceptions and really uplifting the data and the voices of those who have experienced homelessness to say, here we are, this is the narrative. And, you know, just like Tyler said, it's not a one and done. You know, homelessness didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to end overnight. And I think oftentimes people want to see that quick response. And we know that we're dealing with several other challenges. Not all people experiencing homelessness have mental health challenges, but a lot do. And, you know, it's whether even a person is homeless or not, anxiety, depression, all of those things are debilitating factors. So just because a person is going through that in itself is really doubling down and looking at the myth that, you know, that doesn't mean a person's not trying. That, you know, imagine the fears that people have to conquer. So I think it's really bringing it together to people's attention about the NIMBYism. And then also it starts with language as well, right? And I think that's an equity piece. So for example, this department that the mayor has stood up is the Department of Homelessness Strategies and Solutions. And that homelessness there is to recognize that homelessness is a condition of a person, not that label of that person. So same reason we say persons experiencing homelessness. One of the things that helps to augment that is having an infrastructure within to help continue that learning. We're all continuing the learning, right? And so again, within this administration, Mayor Gloria has also hired up a chief race and equity officer. So this department is working closely with that department to make sure that we're utilizing the right language. We're helping to advance the appropriate advance the misunderstandings. And also, I know the San Diego Housing Commission, a very strong partner of ours, they also have a robust diversity and equity team. So really leaning on all of those resources that we have so we could message in an equitable way.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you brought up the title of your department, right? On homeless strategies and solutions, right? Homelessness. And I think Tamara Kohler is on this call right now from Regional Task Force on Homelessness. And they recently changed their name from On the Homeless to Homelessness. And I was so excited when I saw that, because prior I was always like, why is it just On the Homeless? Like, it just seems a little like, you know, because so many times it's beyond our control. And so I think those little language bits makes a huge difference. And it's something that we can all do. It starts at home, kind of one of those things. Right. If you don't have the means to donate or get involved on a committee or work in this sector, you can use simple language like our unhoused neighbors.
Exactly. And one thing you mentioned, Tamara, and the regional task force is also the ad hoc committee on Black San Diegans experiencing homelessness, right? And really doubling down and looking, and even our state partners, you know, the grants that we are receiving as part of the homeless housing assisted prevention, there's so much equity in that. And the state has also released equity tools. So really making sure that we're leveraging and we're helping to advance that message.
Yeah, I'm on that committee, and I just kind of sit and listen because I'm constantly learning about all the different ways that that the data isn't reflected of how BIPOC people, specifically Black Americans, are experiencing homelessness. We know that it's historically more people of color, but then that's where the data ends. There's not this lot of tracking, and it's encouraging to see the conversations that are being had and to see, you know, Omar Passons with the county there. And I think Sean Spear with Community Housing Works is on it as well. And Hassan with PATH. And it's just great to see all these different organizations coming together and really acknowledging the holes that we might have, and then figuring out how we can really use, you know, better data and ask these questions that weren't necessarily asked before. So Madison, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you again. And I would love to hear about, you know, how does climate and housing. I think sometimes people don't think that there's that overlap. It's either one or the other. You have a lot of like these really strong environmentalists who might not necessarily agree with dense building. So please share with us.
Yeah. So I'll touch a bit on homelessness as well. So, as Tyler said, I've heard that homeless people are lazy, all addicts of some sort, need to find a job. And I just read an article yesterday, actually, that said 40% of homelessness people are employed, which is insane to me that someone can be employed and still not be able to afford housing. But for housing, I've heard that, to your point, that infill or centralizing housing development only in the urban core will increase traffic congestion and a shortage of electric power. I touched a bit on how creating affordable housing in the urban core would actually lower VMT and car dependency through reducing traffic, or therefore reducing traffic congestion by car at least. And CAC also advocates for all electric homes and buildings. So sustainable housing powered by clean energy and free of dangerous indoor air pollutants such as methane gas. A perception that I often hear is that ending single family zoning, increasing density, and developing more missing middle housing such as ADUs or accessory dwelling units on one single family zone land will negatively impact what folks call the community character of a neighborhood, and take away green and open spaces. So it can be a huge undertaking to create sustainable cities financially and logistically. We completely understand that. We know that there's no one size fits all to ending homelessness and solving the housing crisis. And that's why it's essential for governance to create a holistic implementation approach to smart growth policies and city development. It shouldn't be one or the other, right? It shouldn't be, if we create higher density housing development, there will be no space for parks and trees. All should be included when prioritizing the environment. And that does include creating shade tree canopies so that we don't create more heat islands on certain areas, which is often inequitable and results in hazardous situations for, we call them communities of color, communities of concern, but they're really low income communities of color. So yeah, that's what I would add.
Yeah, no, I love that. I was just in Portland and just for one single day, and I loved how many trees there were. So many trees. And I was like, we need more trees, all the trees. I felt like Oprah, you get a tree, you get a tree. But Lisa, I would love to hear, from your perspective, and Tyler kind of made a comment about this, of how media sometimes leans into some of these misconceptions. Not all the times, and definitely I don't think Voice does this. So if Scott Lewis rewatches this, I'm not saying that about Voice, but I think we do know, locally and some other networks that lean into some of these misconceptions. But how do you, as a reporter and a journalist, and especially I think an investigative journalist who digs deeper, how do you handle some of these misconceptions around housing and homelessness?
Well, I think one thing that separates me and Voice from some of the other reporters that you see is I'm lucky enough to be a beat reporter. I get to really dig in and learn about these topics. And many other journalists, they're on a quick deadline, but I still think that there are a lot of opportunities. I think whether it's me or other journalists in town, we all want to do a good job and we want to have a good story that is correct and has the right context. And so sometimes we're going to dig around in areas that folks really would rather we not dig around. But I think that there's space to consider these stories opportunities. So, recently, I'll give an example, actually. I'll just throw out a recent example. I know Tyler knows this is coming. A colleague and I were hearing about some challenges at 2 hotels that the city purchased last year. And so we started making calls, doing our data requests that we do. That's what reporters do. But I really wanted to have some good in-depth conversations with folks at PATH and Father Joe's Villages and at the city and the Housing Commission. And at first, a lot of the engagement was over email. That's how it often starts. And I picked up the phone to multiple different folks and I said, you know what, this is a really complicated, nuanced, important issue. We had a bunch of state money come down that allowed our city to purchase these hotels. And our leaders have decided that we should invest in more permanent supportive housing. So, okay, if that's the case, let's really understand what is actually going on here and what are people on the ground seeing. And let's have some real talk with folks both at the city and at PATH. So I cleared this with Tyler so I could kind of share this story beforehand. But when I started doing this initially, you know, I was trying to reach out a lot and there was some reluctance, right? Because every time this happens, it's not unique to PATH by any means. There's a little bit of reluctance. What is this reporter doing? But I kept following up. Not every reporter is going to have the time to keep following up. But I would encourage you all, and I'll let Tyler kind of give his perspective of this because I'm just giving mine. I've got my moment here. You know, I would just encourage folks to see it as an opportunity. One thing that just constantly, you know, surprises me here is I have written stories and I included them in the chat, breaking down the most common myths that I hear about homeless individuals. I did an explainer a couple years back on the different types of homeless housing. And it just surprises me that there hasn't really been a community effort to have those conversations. I'm a journalist. I'm independent. I have a bias that I want homeless people to be housed. I want to reduce homelessness. And I do what I can in my role. But there's a lot that the community could really benefit from, some real talk and definitions and explanations. Because when we have a challenge in our community, we talk a lot about this at Voice, you want to enroll people in your narrative. You want people to understand what the challenges are. And as a journalist, I'm going to dig right into those challenges and ask all kinds of questions about them. But it's okay for you guys to do that too. I would say that on a bunch of topics. So just would encourage conversations with journalists. And again, like just to close out, just because a journalist is asking tough questions doesn't mean that it's not an opportunity to educate and to really help the community understand what the challenges are and what the myths are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's entirely, you'll probably echo this as well. That's part of what we do, is being like, all right, I hear your question. And what I'm going to say is a different response, because this is an opportunity for me to educate you, if you will, or inform you, or just teach you something new. But Tyler, do you have anything to share about this? I can't wait to read this story, but.
Yeah, definitely. No, I appreciate the perspective that Lisa shared. And, you know, for us as a service provider, we are working with elected officials, with other agencies, with other service providers. We're not the sole entity that gets to tell the full story, but we have a part in telling that story. And I will admit, at first, we sometimes are resistant to answering tough questions. And I think the root of that is we don't want people to be discouraged. We don't want people to think that these solutions don't work, or they're not worth it, or it's not worth the investment of public funds. But you get to a point where you need to be realistic and say, you know what, we've done some good, we've had some challenges. You know, for us in our sector, there's, you know, pay is a big issue. You know, we don't pay people enough to work with really vulnerable populations. And that's something, if we don't talk about it, it's not going to change. We're going to expect the same outcomes with not enough resources. So, you know, we eventually came around to say, like, this is an important truth to admit, that we are doing good, but we could do better in these areas. These are the resources we need to do better. And overall, we have done positive work and there's been a good impact, but there's always lessons learned. So, you know, we also want to do some expectation setting with the public, right? It's not just we announce this program, you never hear about it again, and it's one and done. But it's like, you know, here we invested in this program. Here's some of the challenges we've had. Here's how we're reorienting. And that should be a part of any solution to any complex problem, right? We don't just throw resources at it, have a press conference, have one story and be done. But reporting like Lisa does really gives gives context to how do these things continue to work? What can we learn from? How could we do it better? And then, that creates a public amount of support for what we do. So we admit that there's challenges in the work that we do, but if we're not talking about solutions with nuance and context, then we're not going to get anywhere. So, people do want these quick solutions to homelessness, but we have to be realistic and we have to talk about the challenges we face as a sector. And it's never that it's not worth it. It's just these are the challenges that we have to work through. But I appreciate any media opportunity that goes beyond the let's pan to some encampments and say, oh, we're investing in this program and that's what it is. We appreciate more nuance, and that's something that I'm committed to doing in our external communications.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you just kind of inspired me to switch up this next question. Originally, I was going to ask you guys about challenges around communicating, but I think I want to also talk about some of these solutions, right? I think part of this conversation in my mind is kind of spinning because I'm like writing down notes and getting inspired by you guys. So thank you all for being here. But I think we face this challenge of wanting to toe this line of being able to provide all the context of, what causes housing and an affordability crisis and homelessness, but then also providing solutions, which can feel like a challenge when you're trying to craft a tweet or a news story to, make sure you're getting all of this big information, but then still being able to leave the reader with a solution or a little bit of hope. I know sometimes the things that I struggle with, the Housing Federation's communications is making sure that we're providing, a little bit of hope of what we're doing and that we're creating, that things are being done, even though it might feel like it's taking a really long time. It takes time to build housing. It takes time to, use outreach with trauma-informed care and to get some of these people who have been homeless for decades, who have been burned in the past. I keep coming back to this analogy of you only need the stove to burn you once before you never touch it again. And imagine like what that happens with housing. If you are burned by a service provider, by a shelter, by an individual, that's all it takes. We can think about this with dating. How many of your friends are like, I dated a Jake, I'm never dating a Jake again, or, people are like, all Scorpios are terrible. And so why don't we apply, apologies to any Scorpios, but, but why don't we think about this when it comes to housing? So that brings me to this question of what are some of maybe our challenges and solutions to creating equitable and inclusive messaging? I'll start with Hafsa.
Well, very good question. And I, want to piggyback off of what Tyler said, right? That whole time is a piece. So going back onto some challenges and solutions, some of the challenges in terms of creating equitable and inclusive messaging is also, again, that realistic factor, right? The realistic factor that you just mentioned, that it takes time to deal with trauma-informed care. It takes time to engage and establish rapport. In essence, there's in best practices, I have a social work background, critical time intervention. It's all woven into it. Strength-based practices. You really have to do assessments and work with people and working throughout all of the different agencies and collaborations. Collaborative works does take time, right? I mean, you're collaborating, you're creating together, you're programming. So I think really putting that at the forefront of communication. And I really, I have never seen the Mayor Gloria and our communications team works very, very hard on making sure that we're working transparently and getting all the information on the best timely manner. And this is one of the best, infrastructures that I've been in that I've seen that. I've seen so much delay, all across. So I feel like one of the most important things about this is looking at the realistic piece that sometimes if folks hear silence, that shouldn't be misunderstood as complacency, that there's much happening and it's thoughtful and it's proactive and it is very strategic, and all of that takes time. Oftentimes, crisis, right? People experiencing homelessness, we see crisis. We want to address crisis, and addressing crisis is happening. You mentioned solutions, Amanda. People can see that there's a person out, on the corner of walk and don't walk, or however you want to say it, apples and oranges, and then that person's still there. That does not mean that that person was not engaged. That does not mean that path had not gone out there. The solutions had been addressed, but it sometimes takes time. So I think, to answer your question in terms of challenges is really uplifting the fact that the reality of the situation and really continuing to educate folks around that.
Yeah, that's great. And did I just hear a trolley horn in your background?
Yes, my windows are closed, but it does have that.
Hey, I get a bus stop sound outside of my apartment, so I'm very in tuned to our public transit sounds. But thank you for that.
I'm sorry. One more thing is really, again, and you're going to constantly hear me say this, is a solution in terms of the challenge of inclusive messaging is also always listening to lived experience persons. It's really important to uplift, hear that. And I think the regional task force has done a great job with that. We in this new department are working with that as well. And that also includes our provider base as well. I think one of the really great things I know about PATH and many other providers is that really providing the opportunities for lived experience persons to move up the ladder and get gainful employment, so that connection and that rapport could be built. So I think that's something that is really critical too.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of the solution, and this kind of was touched on in our keynote with Mark, who's the CEO of the King County Regional Authority on Homelessness. Long name. I Googled where King County is. It's like north central, in case anybody didn't know, like myself. I thought it was in Seattle for some reason. It sounds like a Washington name. Anyway, he talked about, empowering those with lived experiences. And one of the things we have here at the Housing Federation is HEAL, which is our Homeless Experienced Advocacy Leadership. I think I messed that up. But it is our organization where we help those who have lived homeless experience and help them gain the leadership tools and, a little bit of the confidence as well to be able to not only go to meetings with elected officials, but, find employment that might align more with their advocacy efforts. So for example, we just hired a new resident organizer, and she is a student at USD who had experienced homelessness. And now she is helping with our forums, which are now tied into the county with Omar's county homelessness department. And so they're really bringing this in, and we're conducting these forums, and I haven't gotten the tea on what's happening there, but I'm excited to learn a little bit more about how we can weave some of that into our messaging, because I think when you share some of these stories, it helps bring it from this big high level of homelessness to a little bit more of these individual stories, instead of following these myths and conceptions, but being able to see that, someone became homeless because of the pandemic, and now they are, struggling to get by, or they became homeless, for whatever reason. There are so many different reasons. It's not just mental illness or drugs. I mean, how many of us who are housed have mental illness? I think lots of us, especially after this last 2 years. But let's go to Lisa. Let's hear a little bit of your challenges and your solutions when you're creating these equitable news clips and stories.
Well, I think it is so important to include the voices of people that are experiencing homelessness. I can't emphasize enough how much I see them as experts in my stories. They really tell me how something's working. And often, just like in the house community, there will be lots of different feelings or thoughts about something, but it's just so important to have those voices and stories. And I think a lot of the stories that I see that I think folks who are watching this might have concerns about are those that don't actually speak to an individual who's experienced homelessness or is currently experiencing homelessness. So that's something I really try to take the time to prioritize getting. I think, also we can have in my industry, we can have some deadline challenges. Sometimes we have to turn around a story really quickly. And I know that that's a challenge for the folks that we're reaching out to as well. But I think, I've been impressed. There are some folks, and I won't necessarily call out, who's doing good or not so good on this, but I will say our homeless service provider community has gotten better at getting back to people quickly. Just realizing that there's a question that's out here. I have to do my story today. As much as I would like to have another day to work on it, I need the answer from you today. And sometimes, I know it's like everybody's got lots of stuff going on, but again, I just think it's so important to think about these stories as potential opportunities. And I'm not saying that in a PR sense, that is not my job, but I do see that there's an opportunity to help people understand the challenges, to help people understand these issues, which are so important. Even if the person that you're concerned about viewing this, who's looking at this as, I just want this person off my sidewalk, it's helpful if that person can understand the other perspective. So it's an opportunity. So that I think that can be a challenge, but again, I just want to keep emphasizing, I know I probably sound like a broken record, but it's such an opportunity if you can stop and sort of take the time to see it as that. I think also, I'll just maybe I'll try to touch on this a little bit because I think it's related, is there's sort of this question about these quick hit stories and what do we do about that? And again, I think it's good to also see that as an opportunity. There's the opportunity in terms of the story, but also this reporter who's approaching you. I was once this reporter. I had never written about homelessness before. This was 2015. And I relied so much on some of those initial folks when I was trying to learn about this issue who said, you know what, let's go get coffee and let's talk about this. Or here's the data that I look at to really evaluate how we're doing. When you have a new reporter that you're interacting with, again, I think there's an opportunity to try to say to them, okay, like if you're interested in this issue, let me give you some extra stuff. And maybe they'll come back and do another story. Maybe it won't get incorporated into the story, unfortunately. But I can tell you, most folks in my industry, we want to do a good job and we care about our communities just as much as all of you do. So I just would emphasize again, don't miss that opportunity to potentially maybe get that reporter interested in this topic and reporting more stories about whether it's maybe it's your new outreach program, or maybe the issue is we're looking at housing production and maybe they've gotten interested in that because you've talked to them about, well, we've got a lot of people that we're reaching in outreach, but where do we place them? That's a challenge. I think that about sums it up for me. Apologize for repeating myself so much. But
no,
I'm trying to get that point across.
I think we all kind of repeat like some of the same things. It really comes down to our values and the opportunities there, and really just being concise. I think that's, I think it's good to hear. And I think what you also brought up is kind of answering one of these questions here is about how can housing advocates shift the way that stories are covered. I think part of that is listening to how that story is covered and then using your platform to tell the other side of that story. So a lot of the ways that I kind of approach, because like you, Lisa, I'm new to this housing side as well, and I'm still really learning about these things. And I see conversations on Nextdoor, and I think, okay, so I see that you guys are not aware of what affordable housing is, that you're not aware of what trauma-informed care is. So then I think I want to make sure that on the housing federations, in our weekly briefs and our newsletters and our social media, that I'm thinking about sharing what trauma-informed care is. It might not get all those people on Nextdoor, but it's helping me figure out where there's opportunities to be an advocate myself, and then also for my organization to kind of be a better place for that advocacy. So Madison, let's hear from you, and then we'll move into our final question and then Q&A.
Cool. So I can give one example of facing challenges in creating equitable and inclusive messaging. So this year, CAC had the opportunity to partner with the city of San Diego to create equitable and inclusive messaging through outreach in 3 different communities of concern, Midway, Linda Vista, and Eastern area. The purpose of the project was to educate these very low to moderately low access communities. On the San Diego CAP, or Climate Action Plan update, for folks that don't know that acronym. Speaking of acronyms, receive their feedback on what they would like to see prioritized in the CAP update, compile that, and then give that information to the city so that the communities could be prioritized, given resources, and invested in. This outreach project took place when COVID was still very much a factor in in-person interactions, especially with strangers. It still is, but even more so earlier in the year. And so we decided to do all of our messaging and outreach virtually. What we learned throughout the process is that a lot of the neighborhoods within these 3 communities weren't accessible online. And for those who were accessible, some of those folks were unfamiliar with or not on social media. So we had a technological literacy barrier and challenges there of how to even begin reaching or contacting these communities with our messaging. We also had language barrier challenges. So it's extremely important to include less affluent communities, which are often communities of color, in which English might not be the majority of the community's first language, into your messaging, especially if you want your messaging to be equitable and inclusive. And then folks on the panel have talked about this, but we had a policy jargon barrier and challenge. So, for example, not everyone knows what greenhouse gas emissions are or transit priority areas are. Those are terms folks in certain spaces here read about on a daily basis, but every sector kind of has its own language in a way, including the environmental sector. And if you don't actively participate in the sector, the jargon could be very unfamiliar and confusing. And so trying to create messaging, I know Tyler touched on this, that meets people where they are in terms of their knowledge or lack thereof on often really complex environmental issues, while still making sure that we convey the importance of whatever message we are trying to convey, and why it pertains directly to the communities and their qualities of life is something that CAC is constantly thinking about when we're creating equitable and inclusive messaging. So what I'll say we learned from the project is that outreach and messaging has to be twofold. So virtual and in person. We're now more in a virtual space since COVID. So we're just gonna have to deal with that. But also what other panelists touched on a bit is in order to incentivize participation, people in these communities need to be compensated. I'll say that again, because it's extremely important. Needs to be compensated in some way for sharing their opinions and lived experiences.
That's great. Thank you. Tyler, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, in Path's messaging, we really try to tell our clients stories to show that there's a broad range of experiences that lead to a person's episode of homelessness. There's unique solutions. And, we try to find that balance between opportunity and exploitation, right? We don't want to overshare. But another thing we try to do, and this is kind of a personal mission of mine, is of course, we want to talk about specific populations, veterans, seniors, families, but we really try to emphasize that everyone deserves a home. Everyone deserves access. It's not just certain special populations that should be in certain communities that should be placed here. And it's broadening that conversation to say that, this is a fundamental right that someone should have access to housing. So, we try to diversify our stories. Every week we share Making It Home story. We include, the challenges that person had to face. Maybe they went to 2 different sites. Maybe they had a roommate issue. And then we also share something that they're hopeful. They're now excited to cook in their new kitchen, just showing everyone experiences the joys of a home, and everyone should have access to that. So we're just like everyone else who want that, with some positive news to share on top of the jargon and the policy and the budget discussions, because it's fundamentally it's a core part of who we are, is to have a place to call home and to have a community.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, and Madison, what you were saying as well, is it's housing at all income levels and all zip codes. And just so we're aware of our time, we've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to, I'm going to weave the last question with one of the other questions that we've gotten with the Q&A, just so we can kind of maximize our time here. So the question that I had sent to you guys was about opportunities for the 2022 and 2024 election and how we can help our messaging. And I'm going to kind of weave it in with Tamara's question here about how we can use the right words, and how can people go to find the right words, which I think kind of weaves in with what do we do for 2022 and 2024 of how are we creating, there's not like a housing homelessness dictionary where we can go and we can find the right words to use. We have panels and conversations like this, but then that doesn't necessarily move to the whole sector. So her question is, where should information be available to make it more accessible, which I think also ties into how can we use some of these opportunities that we've discussed today for 2022 to make it more impactful for people to know what they're voting on. When I voted in 2020, there's that big old booklet. It feels like a big open test. I'm Googling things. I'm, figuring out definitions. I don't know what things mean. And how do we make it more accessible for the general voting public to really kind of understand the messaging within this jargon-filled budget, numbers, bureaucratic, service providers, hopscotch of a mess. So I'll let someone pick who wants to go first. So we'll see who's brave.
I can, go for it. No, I was going to say I can go first selfishly so that if I don't say the right thing, people will forget by the last person. Unless somebody else wants to go, I can take a second. Okay. For opportunities for future messaging, I think for the elections, I think a huge opportunity is to continue to frame messaging through storytelling and individual struggles. That's has been touched on in the panel that folks experience as a result of macro scaled issues. I think as a society, we can become quickly desensitized to information because we're constantly receiving new information. And so framing messaging in a relatable way is really important to grabbing the attention of a targeted audience. Another opportunity is for future messaging to target the youth. So maybe like ages 18 to 30. There's two generations in there, but I'll use housing as an example. So the millennial generation can be very cynical about the topic of housing. There are college graduates with good paying jobs that can't afford housing. I'm 25 and recently moved to San Diego from the Bay Area this summer. And before that, I was living at home. My sister is 28 and makes, I'll just say, way more money than I do, and is still living at home because, she's at the point of her life where she wants to own a home and not rent. And so home ownership, especially in California, is extremely expensive. And so when we target the youth on particular topics, we have to do it in a truthful way. Our messaging has to convey that and affirm that, the housing crisis, for example, disproportionately affects the youth, and that we've gotten the short end of the stick in this generation when it comes to housing. And that there are macro scale reasons outside of the control of individuals that have caused the housing crisis. And I think when you have that truthful and relatable messaging, people, especially the youth, are more receptive to it and inclined to engage in your mission. And then I think, last point, I think cities' websites should be more accessible. For example, not to call out, but the county's website, to me, is very confusing at times. And cities should have more toolkits, which are basically summaries of different issues that people can go in very quickly and look at. Because to your point of ballots, right? Even me as somebody that's in this space of politics, I don't have the time to read through 20 20 pages for 5 ballots, or 20 people running for election. So toolkits is really important as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the idea of placing it on our counties or cities who can kind of, well, not necessarily placing it and leaving it up to them, right? Bringing us into this conversation as well, but being able to create a toolkit that we can then share and spread across our communities. But Hafsa, go ahead. I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, these were all really good questions. And I think what's one thing that I would like to elevate in terms of the messaging is, as I mentioned earlier, we have a really robust comms team that works very hard to try to get all the information out. And Lisa, we're always in conversation. But really, one thing that we've done is from the mayor's office is press releases. And it really has been a great format, along with, as you mentioned, the IG and the Facebook and the WhatsApp. But these press releases is really a value driven on, again, going back onto that transparency and communication and changing the status quo and making it people centered. And I think the perfect example I'll give is yesterday's press release that came out in terms of how Mayor Gloria and this new administration, this new department has been able to go ahead and partner with Caltrans for robust outreach for the unhoused and unsheltered community in the Caltrans right away. And what you saw on there was a real collaborative approach. You saw the communication between the state, Governor Newsom, Mayor Gloria, this new department to help with that capacity and the work, and the new provider that's coming on board. So things like that to really let the general public know that we're doing exciting things and expanding our ecosystem of care, and also continue to work together with very critical partners such as the Housing Commission and Regional Task Force and Downtown Partnership and so on and so forth, PATH, and of course all of the providers. So it's really great to be able to have that ability to really elevate what's exciting and coming through. The other thing I do want to say also is making sure that we're elevating, again, the voices of those who are experiencing homelessness from their perspective. And of course, with HIPAA rights, right? I mean, we don't want, I think earlier Tyler had mentioned making sure that we're not violating people's rights, but also if persons experiencing homelessness want to share their stories, that's definitely something that I would like to elevate in this new department and our website and our page, of course, with all HIPAA, appropriate consent forms and whatnot. So these are some of the things that we'll be working towards, because oftentimes I think people, just will see the challenges, but the solutions have happened and folks have gotten housed, but how do we know, right? And so it's really good to be able to really show the forward movement. So those are some of the things I would say.
I love that. And I think press releases are something that's coming back after we had the Facebook and Instagram outage of a week or so ago. It was a nice reminder that those platforms that we've become to rely on for the last decade might not be there in another decade. And what does that mean for how are we, going to do our messaging? And it's really kind of going back to basics, and that's journalism and press releases. And I think that's kind of exciting because I love writing a press release.
And I also want to take a moment here to acknowledge, right? Like we know Lisa's on here and the Voice of San Diego you've done a lot of coverage on homelessness and housing. And so it's these methods too, right? And so, we obviously KPBS and the news and, just recently for this press release, I've been inquired a lot, and Mayor's been inquired a lot. And so really tapping into those media outlets as well.
Yeah, that's great. And Lisa and Tyler, I'm going to switch it up for you guys for another question. So can you two touch on the differences between sympathetic and empathetic stories? I think I'd be curious to kind of hear from your perspectives, right, Tyler, as a service provider, where I think we don't want to go down this route of poverty porn type of Sarah McLachlan music overlay, that's a little too sympathetic, but we also don't want to be so, gung-ho investigative, where we're ignoring some of the empathy that needs to be included. So which one of you would like to go first? Yay, Tyler, go for
Sure,
it.
yeah, I can go. Yeah, I mean, kind of reiterating my last point is, just letting folks tell their story for one. Like, we try to make sure folks are, if they're a resident or a client of ours, that they're in a good space to share their story. But we really try not to curate it too much, and we just let them have the floor, let them have that opportunity. But in the stories that we share and put out on social media, we try to illuminate that it could happen to you, right? Like you could have a series of medical bills that result in you losing access to your home. You could have a job and still be experiencing homelessness. You can have, we just try to tell a lot of different stories to not just pigeonhole, like this is how one person, their life leads to homelessness, but we just try to expand that, let people tell their own story. And I think naturally in that, there's things that people are gonna empathize with, who are gonna say, oh, I know someone who that happened to, or I could see that happening in my life. So we try to show that they're not such extreme cases. That's not the only thing that leads to a person, experiencing homelessness. And I think that's the sympathetic kind of angle that this question is getting at, and that's moving beyond the like let's talk about homelessness and show a bunch of encampments and show tents and show people living at their worst, and let's just exploit that moment and show them in their most challenging time. But let's show them when they're in an interim housing site. Let's show them when they're in a hotel or motel for a temporary stay. Let's show someone who is now permanently housed, and showing like all those different layers, not just like the two ends of it, I think are important to know that like there's a process, it takes time, but there's steps along the way, and people need to realize that it's not just this one and done.
Yeah,
I think Tyler handled that pretty well. I would say too, that just as a journalist, I know I try to make sure that the person I'm talking to is really clear on how their story could be used or what my role is, that I'm not here necessarily to be, the person that is just going to write their story unvarnished. What I'm doing is they're helping to tell a story, and that can help people. And I just do want to say here that some of my sources experiencing homelessness over the years have been my absolute best sources, most helpful, most willing to introduce me to other people or to point out issues that should be on my radar. So I definitely would encourage folks listening in to, obviously give that person, their choice of whether they want to engage, but it can be a really positive experience for both the person and the journalist, because it's a way for them to explain the challenges that they faced, what worked for them, what isn't working, and that can be really powerful for that other individual as well. I do want to answer that last question real quick and just point something out that has interested me. Journalists, a lot of us, I wish I had it right next to me here. We have an Associated Press style guide that we reference when we're writing stories that tells us, where's the comma supposed to go? And do we use an E or an O in the word advisor, for example? But there also are style guides for other topics. So there's a style guide for reporting on people with disabilities, for example. There is not a style guide on homelessness. And that's something I've thought about, over the years, that there's not sort of a homelessness and housing style guide. Now, we have had a lot of discussions among journalists that cover these topics about, like, for example, use of the word transients. That's not a word that I use. Or referring to people as the homeless. That is not something that I do. Sometimes that might appear in a headline, but that's not the ideal situation. So I just kind of throw that idea out there that that's just something that, some other sectors have worked with journalism groups to come up with these style guides, but that's not something that I've seen for the homelessness sector.
That's a great point. You're making me think of, like, we have AP style guides, and I remember when I was in undergrad, and it was like this whole, the part Purdue or whatever, where you have to learn your MLA and your APA and where do your commas go, and is it Oxford comma or not, or whatever. But I think that's a great point, and I think maybe there's a way to think about how we can create one. If there's any funders listening, please let us know. We are more than happy to help you put something together. But we are at our time for today. So thank you all for being here. It really means a lot to me that you guys were on this great panel. And to our attendees, thank you for listening. I know we got a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I am saving those for later. And I hope that maybe we can bring them up at a roundtable or one of our other programming events. So thank you all. And attendees, be sure to stay on for a few more minutes for a daily meditation to just kind of reset yourself for the rest of the conference. And panelists, you guys are welcome to stay as well. It's kind of a nice way to shake off a little bit of this heaviness of today's discussion. But thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello, Sandy. My name is Loretta Turner. Today I have a 5-minute meditation for you that'll hopefully help us with this information overload that we might be receiving through the conference. And so with all this information that we're receiving, there's a lot to think about, a lot to process, a lot to sort through. And so it's really important for us to take breaks and kind of just reset our bodies, reset our minds. Let's go ahead and begin. And the first thing I always recommend you do here is just clear your space a little bit. Wherever you are in the world, it might be helpful to remove things from your environment that might distract you over the next few minutes. That might mean taking your phone to the side, turning off your monitor, maybe just getting up and away from the desk if you can. So take a few moments to allow your space to be a little bit more welcoming. And then also make sure that wherever you are physically comfortable. Whether you're seated or lying down or standing, you want to be able to be comfortable in this meditation for the next few moments. If it feels okay for you to close your eyes, I encourage you to do that. Or you can just soften your eyelids, maybe bringing your focus off the tip of your nose down at the ground beneath you. And let's take a moment here to just acknowledge all the thoughts, acknowledge the busyness, acknowledge the notes you've been taking, acknowledge all the chaos maybe that's coming up for you. No need to judge any of it or even try to make sense of any of it, but just being observant, just acknowledging what's there. And then imagine that you had a volume dial on all of what you're thinking about. And just start to turn down the volume, turn down any feelings associated with all of those thoughts. And then use a different dial to start to turn up the sound and the feeling of your own breath. So really feel your inhale as it expands your lungs and fills up your body. And similarly, feel the exhale as you rid the body of air. Deep inhale. Deep exhale. Deep inhale. Deep exhale. And what you can do with each round of breath is you can tell yourself that you're breathing, right? Use a mantra, use some words. I am inhaling. And I am exhaling. And when, not if, but when you notice that your mind has wandered elsewhere, you just come back to the mantra. I am inhaling. I am exhaling. You can also count your breath. Maybe inhale up to the number 5. Exhale down to the number 1. And again, when the mind wanders and goes somewhere else, just remind yourself to count up and to count down. The last thing you can do with your breath is add a visual. And my favorite is when I inhale, there is a ball on my spine and it gets pulled to the very bottom of my spine when I breathe in. And then when I exhale, the same ball floats back up to the top of my head. Again, inhale, the ball comes down the spine to the very bottom. Exhale, I release the ball and it floats to the top of the head. And then again, of course, when the mind wanders, you just bring your attention back to the visual of setting the ball up and down. Or using a counting mechanism, counting up the breath, counting down the breath. Or just simply telling yourself that you're breathing in and you're breathing out. The most important thing here is that when you catch yourself thinking about something else, you give yourself grace, you give yourself permission to let the thoughts go and just breathe. Deep breaths in, deep breaths out. Deep breaths in, deep breaths out.